During the early morning of April 16, 1966, in Portage County, Ohio, a high-speed police chase was underway as Deputy Sheriff Dale Spower and Deputy Barney Neff hurtled down country roads. But the rabbit in this particular chase wasn't a desperate criminal in a souped-up car. Instead, it was a shining object in the sky, big as a house, and shaped like the top of an umbrella, or half a football, or, if you prefer, a flying saucer.
This is only a test.
Here's what happened. After an extremely 1960s-style dinner of steak and eggs and 2 cups of coffee, Officer Spower picked up Deputy Neff for their midnight shift and drove to the scene of a crashed car that had run into a utility pole. After sending the driver to the hospital and arranging for the car to be towed, they drove to the nearby town of Deerfield for some more coffee. Then they headed back to the scene of the crash to make sure the knockdown utility pole was being dealt with. They arrived back at the scene of the accident around 4:45 a.m. While talking to the utility worker, the officers received a radio call about a woman reporting a brightly lit object as big as a house flying over her neighborhood. Spower and Neff didn't take it too seriously and got into their squad car and drove west on Route 224 to fill out an accident report at the hospital. On the way, they stopped to investigate a car that they came across at the side of the road. As they got out of their own car, Spower reports, "I got out the left side, and I went to the left rear of the other vehicle. I turned just to make sort of a visual observation of the area, to make sure nobody had walked into the woods, to take a leak or something. And when I looked into this wooded area behind us, I saw this thing. At this time it was went up to about treetop level, I'd say about 100 feet. It started moving towards us. I looked at Barney and told him to look over his shoulder, so he did. He didn't say nothing. He just stood there with his mouth open for a minute. The only sound in the whole area was a hum." Spower reported that both he and Neff were petrified for a few moments before both running back to the safety of the patrol car, from which they sat and watched the UFO drift over them. They called it into the station and were first told by the dispatcher to open fire on the object.
Shoot it!
But by then it had moved out of range, so the patrolmen were told to give chase.
I guess just chase the friggin' thing then.
As Spower and Neff chased the object at speeds that occasionally hit 105 miles an hour, they were still on the radio with their dispatcher. Another officer named Wayne Houston was in the nearby town of East Palestine when he heard the radio conversation and started looking for the UFO himself. According to Houston, he saw an object about 800 feet off the ground fly overhead and joined in the chase with Spower's car, continuing towards the Pennsylvania border at approximately 85 miles an hour. All the while, the strange object continued flying ahead of them. When the 2 cars stopped for gas in Conway, Pennsylvania at 5 o'clock in the morning, they met up with another local police officer named Frank Penzanella. Penzanella hadn't heard the radio communications between Spower and Houston, but he had seen a strange object in the sky. He was watching it when Spower and Houston pulled up in their cars. Penzanella called into his own dispatcher to tell them to notify the Pittsburgh airport. At that point, the 4 officers report that the object climbed to a height of approximately 3,500 feet to the left of the moon. Then, it shot straight up and disappeared.
Probably just a weather balloon.
There were no weather balloons in the area that night, and even if there had been, the wind was only blowing at about 3 miles an hour, not nearly enough velocity for a balloon to participate in a high-speed car chase.
So it's settled. It was a weather balloon.
The official explanation from Project Blue Book, by then being run by Lieutenant Colonel Hector Quintanilla, was that the men were at first confused and simply chasing a satellite, and then later in the chase became even more confused and were actually just looking at the planet Venus. This despite the fact that, 1. According to the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory, there were no satellites visible over Ohio that night. 2. Venus should have been on the right of the moon at that time of the morning, not the left. And 3. Neither satellites nor Venus ever looked like a house-sized half football.
You're crazy, man.
Neff, Penzanella, and Houston never recanted their testimony, but they did stop talking to people about what happened that night, and Houston quit his job and moved to Seattle to become a bus driver, later saying, "Sure, I quit because of that thing. People laughed at me, and there was pressure. You couldn't put your finger on it, but the pressure was there. The city officials didn't like police officers chasing flying saucers." But Spower didn't back down on his claims, despite the official explanation from the Air Force. The stress of being held up to ridicule as the cop who chased a flying saucer took its toll on Spower. And 6 months after this incident, he had lost both his job and his family and was living in a motel. showing that chasing UFOs can be a dangerous thing, in more than one sense.